हो जाता है, वो भी छोटा हो जाता है। Okay, class. Last week we had studied about two types of processes: ultrafiltration and selective reabsorption. ठीक है, लिखवाया था मैंने उनके बारे में, मतलब नाम डिस्कस किया था, एक्सप्लेन नहीं किया था। ठीक है, आज हम उनकी एक्सप्लेनेशन करेंगे पूरी। ठीक है, हेडिंग डालें फॉर्मेशन ऑफ यूरिन। अल्ट्राफिल्ट्रेशन एंड सेलेक्टिव रीअब्सॉर्प्शन। अच्छा, पहले मैं पूरा लिखवा देती हूँ। ठीक है, फिर मैं उसको एक्सप्लेन कर दूंगी कि किस जगह किस कैसे हो रहा है। ओके सो दो प्रोसेसेस इन्वॉल्व हैं, अल्ट्राफिल्ट्रेशन और सेलेक्टिव रीअब्जॉर्प्शन। ठीक है, दो प्रोसेसेस इन्वॉल्व हैं आपके, अल्ट्राफिल्ट्रेशन और रीअब्जॉर्प्शन। राइट, अल्ट्राफिल्ट्रेशन में क्या होता है कि सारा जो छोटे छोटे मटेरियल्स होते हैं लाइक ग्लूकोज, वाटर, यूरिया, अमाइनो एसिड्स, मिनरल सॉल्ट्स, ये सारे के सारे जो हैं they diffuse out of the blood capillaries into the structure of the nephron. ठीक है, and when this the remaining filtrate it reaches the second part of the क्या कहते हैं नेफ्रॉन, जिसे हम लूप ऑफ हेनले, वो यू शेप ट्यूब है और फिर सेकंड कॉन्वोल्यूटेड ट्यूब है, अभी मैं डायग्राम के साथ भी दिखाती हूँ तुम लोगों को। वहां पहुंचते हैं तो वहां जाके क्या होता है, सेलेक्टिव रीअब्जॉर्प्शन, यानी जिन चीजों को बॉडी को लगता है कि ये मेरे काम की चीजें हैं जो कि यूरिन में जाके मुझे बॉडी को नुकसान हो सकता है, उन चीजों को वापस बॉडी की तरफ वापस ब्लड के अंदर रीअब्जॉर्ब किया जाता है और फिर रिमेनिंग सामान को आगे कर दिया जाता है ताकि वो यूरिन में कन्वर्ट होके बॉडी से एक्सपेल आउट हो जाए। ये बिल्कुल उसी तरह से होता है बेटा, अगर आपको हो कभी घर में अम्मी ने किसी चीज की सफाई की हो, कमरों की, अलमारियों की, किसी चीज की, तो जगह बनाने के चक्कर में क्या होता है, ये भी निकाल दो, ये भी आउट कर दो, ये भी आउट कर दो, ये भी रिमूव कर दो, ये भी दे दो, ये भी दे दो, कर दिया। अब जब थैले बन रहे होते हैं उनको देने के लिए, तो उसमें कहते हैं कि अच्छा चलो ये दुपट्टा रख लेते हैं, ये काम आ जाएगा, अच्छा ये वाला सूट मैं उसको दे दूंगी और ये शलवार मेरे उस सूट के साथ चल जाएगी। ऐसे ही करते हैं ना अक्सर हम घर में। तो बिल्कुल वही प्रोसेस है, सबसे पहले जब सब चीजें आप निकाल रहे हैं तो किडनी सब चीजों को फिल्टर कर रही है, यानी अल्ट्रा फिल्ट्रेशन का प्रोसेस हो रहा है। और फिर जब वो यूरिन फाइनली बनने जा रहा होता है तो वो उन चीजों को सिलेक्ट करता है कि हाँ ये ग्लूकोज काम आ सकता है, इसको रीअब्सॉर्ब कर लो, अच्छा थोड़ा सा मिनरल आयन रोक लेता हूँ मैं, ठीक है, वाटर, बॉडी डिहाइड्रेट हो रही है, वाटर रीअब्सॉर्ब कर लेता हूँ। तो वो फिर क्या करता है, सेलेक्टिव रीअब्सॉर्प्शन करता है, यानी ये किडनी कर रहा है, नेफ्रॉन का अपना स्ट्रक्चर जो किडनी के अंदर है वो कर रहा है। ठीक है, अम्मी तो घर में कर रही है, किडनी भी इसी तरह का काम कर रही है हमारी। सही है, तो ये दो प्रोसेसेस जो हैं एक्चुअली इन्वॉल्व होते हैं किस चीज में, फॉर्मेशन ऑफ यूरिन। ये लिखो तो फिर मैं डायग्राम के हिसाब से दिखाती हूँ, फिर मैं इसको फर्दर एक्सप्लेन करूँ। दूर तुम्हें नहीं लिखना, फिर तुम्हारी तेरी मेरी कॉपी पूरा लिख लिया। हो गया। पूरे अगस्त में एक दफा बारिश हुई, पूरे जुलाई में एक दफा बारिश हुई, और सितंबर में जब मॉनसून खत्म हो जाता है तो बारिश ही बारिश हुई। कितने एमसीक्यूज थे? अच्छा, पता है क्या आपको, क्विज का टाइम कम नहीं था, क्योंकि आप 40 एमसीक्यूज 60 मिनट्स में करोगे। 40 एमसीक्यूज आप 60 मिनट्स में करोगे, जो आपका पास पेपर या सीआई का पैटर्न, यानी 10 मिनट ज़्यादा। तो मैंने 13 एमसीक्यूज के हिसाब से 20 मिनट्स दिए। तो तुम्हारी किस्मत में क्या कह सकती हूँ, लेकिन चलो, अब ये देख रहा है तुम लोगों को, ठीक है? ये बेसिकली वोमेन्स कैप्सूल है, एंड दिस इज द फर्स्ट कॉन्वोल्यूटेड ट्यूब, ठीक है? ये दो एरियाज वो हैं जहां पे आपका अल्ट्रा फिल्ट्रेशन का प्रोसेस हो रहा है, ठीक है? ये यू शेप वोमेन्स कैप्सूल एंड द फर्स्ट कॉन्वोल्यूटेड ट्यूब। फिर उसके बाद ये जो आपका यू शेप ट्यूब है, जिसे लूप ऑफ हेनले कहा जाता है, एंड द सेकेंड कॉन्वोल्यूटेड ट्यूब, ये वो एरिया है जहां पे आपका सेलेक्टिव रीअब्जॉर्प्शन है। सेलेक्टिव रीअब्जॉर्प्शन होने के बाद जो भी फिल्ट्रेट होता है वो यहाँ पे कलेक्टिंग डक्ट के अंदर आता है, कलेक्टिंग डक्ट से जाता है यहाँ पे रीनल पेल्विस में, यहाँ पे रीनल पेल्विस में आता है, रीनल पेल्विस से फिर ये नीचे यूरिटर, यूरिटर से ब्लैडर। क्लियर? ठीक है, इस तरह से बेसिकली होता है। अच्छा, जो हमने इसकी एक मैंने पीछे वीडियो भी दिखाई है बच्चों को, ठीक है? चलिए,
Hi and welcome back to freesciencelessons.co.uk. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe the different ways that water can leave the human body. You should then be able to explain the role of the kidney in maintaining the concentration of substances in the blood. And if you're a higher tier student, then you should be able to explain how the body deals with excess amino acids. And all of this is for triple biology students only. In a previous topic, we looked at osmosis. Remember that osmosis is the diffusion of water from a dilute solution to a concentrated solution through a partially permeable membrane. Now, it's really important that the body keeps the level of water in the blood as constant as possible. If the blood becomes too dilute, then water moves into cells by osmosis. And if the blood becomes too concentrated, then water moves by osmosis out of cells. And if body cells gain or lose too much water by osmosis, then they don't work efficiently. So the body has a system in place to maintain its water balance, and this is part of homeostasis. The body takes in water through food and drink, but there are three ways that the body can lose water. Firstly, we lose water via the lungs when we exhale, and the body has no way to control this water loss. Secondly, when we sweat, we lose water through the skin. Sweat also contains ions, such as the sodium ion, and it also contains the waste product urea. Again, the body cannot control how much water, ions, or urea is lost by sweating, and that's because sweating is part of the body's temperature control system. The third way that the body loses water is via the kidneys in urine. Now, the body can control how much water is lost in urine. So if the blood is too dilute, the kidneys remove the excess water, and they produce a greater volume of urine. As well as excess water, urea and excess ions are also removed in urine. So we're going to look now at how the kidneys remove the waste product urea and also adjust the levels of water and ions. Humans have two kidneys. Blood enters the kidney through an artery, and this blood contains the waste product urea. The kidney removes this urea, as well as excess ions and excess water. These leave the kidney as urine, and this is stored in the bladder. Blood now leaves the kidney through a vein, and as you can see, the blood now contains no urea. So let's see how the kidneys adjust the levels of molecules in the blood. Now I should point out that you're not meant to memorize this diagram. However, you are meant to understand the principles behind it. First, the blood passes through capillaries. Here, small molecules are filtered out of the blood. These include urea, ions, and water.
ये ultrafiltration दिखा रहे हैं initially, ठीक है?
As well as the sugar, glucose. These pass into a tube, which I'm showing in yellow. Now, all of the glucose, some of the ions, and some of the water is reabsorbed back into the blood. Scientists call this selective reabsorption. Urea, excess ions, and excess water are released as urine. I'm showing you here the concentrations of glucose, ions, and urea in the blood before and after it's passed through the kidneys. As you can see, the concentration of glucose in the blood has not changed. As we said before, the kidneys filter glucose out of the blood, but then reabsorb it all back into the blood. The concentration of ions in the blood has decreased. Remember that the kidneys filter ions out of the blood. However, they then reabsorb a certain amount of ions back into the blood, depending on the needs of the body. And finally, the concentration of urea in the blood falls to virtually zero as it passes through the kidneys. That's because the kidneys filter out all of the urea and do not reabsorb it. So to recap, all of the urea has been removed from the blood.
अब तुम ये तीनों डायग्राम्स को देखोगे, जितना ग्लूकोज ब्लड में शुरू में था रीनल आर्टरी में, उतना ही रीनल वेन में वापस जा रहा है. अच्छा, मिनरल सॉल्ट्स में क्या है, जितने मिनरल सॉल्ट्स रीनल आर्टरी में थे सेम कॉन्सेंट्रेशन नहीं है. कुछ जो यूजफुल सॉल्ट्स हैं वो रीअब्सॉर्ब हो गए, बाकी यूरिन में पास आउट हो गए. लेकिन जितना रीनल आर्टरी में यूरिया था, रीनल वेन में यूरिया बिल्कुल भी नहीं. ठीक है, these are the three things that you need to keep in mind.
And the concentrations of water and ions have been adjusted.
इसके अलावा एक चीज और रीनल आर्टरी और रीनल वेन की याद रखना, रीनल आर्टरी कंटेन्स ऑक्सीजन, whereas renal vein will have carbon dioxide. है आ रही है. हाँ मैं वीडियो रिकॉर्ड हो रही है, टेंशन नहीं लेना. तुम भी अली बहन हो? नहीं, बैठ जा. ठीक है.
In other words, the kidneys are carrying out homeostasis. Now, if you're a higher tier student, you need to be able to describe how the body deals with excess amino acids. So we're going to look at that now. As we've seen before, proteins are long chains of amino acids. Now, we get a lot of protein in our diet, and when we digest this protein, amino acids pass into the blood. The problem is that we often eat more protein than the body needs. So the liver breaks down the excess amino acids and produces the chemical ammonia. This process is called deamination, and you need to learn that word. Ammonia is a very toxic chemical, so the liver immediately converts it to urea. And as we've seen, the urea can be safely excreted by the kidneys. In the next video, we're going to look at how the endocrine system is used to control the body's water balance. But we're also going to look at kidney dialysis and kidney transplants. Remember, you'll find plenty of questions on the kidneys in my revision workbook, and you can get that by clicking on the link above.
फ्राइडे को पीरियड ही वहाँ करवाई नहीं रिकॉर्ड क्लास है. फ्राइडे को जो मैं पढ़ाऊंगी तो मैं रिकॉर्ड
The job of the kidneys is to filter the blood. Basically, we get dirty blood entering and clean blood leaving, and all of the waste products that are taken from that dirty blood exit as urine. Words like dirty blood and
रीनल आर्टरी से जा रहा है. नहीं, ये बेसिकली डर्टी इसको इसलिए कह रहे हैं क्योंकि इसमें यूरिया प्रेजेंट है, वरना ये है ऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड, लेकिन क्योंकि इसमें यूरिया प्रेजेंट है तो उसको डर्टी ब्लड है. कलर वो रेडी होगा क्योंकि ऑक्सीजनेटेड है, वो पास कर देगा किडनी की तरफ, कोई मसला नहीं है.
clean blood aren't particularly
से होता हुआ ही आता है, क्योंकि जब आपके लिवर से हेपेटिक वेन निकलती है तो वो लंग की तरफ जाती है, फिर वो लंग से घूमता हुआ यूरिया रीनल आर्टरी की तरफ आएगा, तो वो जो है फिल्टर करवाएगा। यूरिया लंग का चक्कर लगाते हुए किडनी की तरफ आता है, क्योंकि हेपेटिक आर्टरी जो है वो हेपेटिक वेन जब लिवर से निकलती है तो वो डीअमाइनेशन से यूरिया बनाती है। अब वेन तो कहाँ जाती है, वेना केवा में, और वेना केवा से हार्ट, हार्ट से लंग्स, लंग से जब एओर्टा में जाएगी तो एओर्टा से रीनल आर्टरी से आएगी किडनी की तरफ, वो घूमता हुआ यूरिया आता है। नुकसान कोई नहीं करता, नहीं, हमारी बॉडी में नहीं है, आपका नहीं पता।
Scientific, but it is a really convenient way to think about it. If we look at the cross section of the kidney, the outermost part is known as the cortex. The next part is the medulla. Next is the pelvis. And the artery that supplies it is known as the renal artery. Renal is just an adjective which describes things to do with the kidney. It makes sense then that the blood vessel that leaves the kidney is known as the renal vein. And the tube which exits the kidney with all of the waste products is known as the ureter. And the ureter connects to the bladder, and then from the bladder, materials can exit the body. Inside of the kidneys, we've got lots and lots and lots of these tiny, tiny little structures, which are known as nephrons. Inside of each kidney, there might be about 1 million of these things. So they're really, really small. Let's look closer at the first step of the nephron here. And now notice that blood which is entering, which is coming from a branch of the renal artery, is coming through a blood vessel which is relatively wide compared to the blood vessel which is leaving this area. And that blood will eventually connect up to the renal.
ये जो afferent और efferent arteriole करवाया था ना, कि efferent चौड़ी होती है, efferent पतली होती है, लास्ट क्लास में ये वो चीज दिखा रही।
Vein. In between all of this is a capillary network known as the glomerulus. And what happens is, because the blood vessel that enters is wider, it kind of gets a little bit constricted as it's trying to leave after the glomerulus. So the result is we get really high pressure inside of the glomerulus. The area surrounding this is known as the Bowman's capsule or the renal capsule, and the high pressure forces material to move from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. Once the material's in the Bowman's capsule, it can then continue on through the tubule. But let's have a little bit of a closer look at how materials move across from the glomerulus and into the Bowman's capsule. Notice that there's lots of tiny little spaces between them. These spaces are really small, meaning that red blood cells can't get through. They're too large. Similarly, other large structures like proteins are mostly too big to get through. Smaller structures, however, little molecules like urea, they are small enough to get through. So urea will transfer into the Bowman's capsule. Now, you might be tempted to think that this is the job done. We've got rid of the toxic material that's gone into the Bowman's capsule. The rest of the blood can continue on as normal and re-enter circulation, and the job's done. Unfortunately, this isn't the end of the story. Because small things can fit through, other small materials, which are quite useful, will also fit through and enter the nephron into the Bowman's capsule. Things like salts, glucose, water, these things are all going to enter. Now, this part is known as ultrafiltration, the movement of materials from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. So in order to get the useful materials back, we know there's got to be a next step. So we've got these materials now moving through the tubule. Let's investigate what's going to happen in a section of this. Here we've got the blood capillary represented in red and the nephron represented in green. And we can see in the nephron are lots of materials. Some of them are useful, some of them are not so useful. These materials kind of move from the nephron into the blood capillary via active transport. Notice that some of the materials have moved, some of them have not. In the blood capillary, we will have glucose, salts, and water being reabsorbed from the nephron. The materials that are left behind, obviously we've got urea, because one of the main purposes here is to get rid of urea. But what we will also have is excess salts and excess water. Your body needs salts and it needs water, but it needs to have these things present in the correct amount. So only the excess materials are left in the nephron to eventually leave the body. Notice here that there is absolutely no glucose left in the nephron. Your body works really hard to get glucose into its system, and it's not going to lose any of it through the urine. It's not going to get rid of any of this stuff. Glucose may be present in urine, but it only happens if there is some sort of underlying medical condition that causes this. Now, this whole process of taking back the materials that are needed is known as selective reabsorption. Don't make the common mistake of calling it absorption. Reabsorption. It's very important that you get it right. Now that you know all the processes that go on, let's have a quick look at all of the labels that need to go onto the nephron. You already know the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, often known as the renal capsule. And next, the two tube areas are known as the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. And they are just the parts that come before and after this loop that's in the middle. And this loop is known as the loop of Henle. The loop has two parts to it. There is the descending limb and the ascending limb. The descending limb being the part where the material falls down, and the ascending limb where it rises up. Next is the collecting duct, and this is where all of the material from the tubule is going to enter. From there, it will go down until it eventually exits the kidney through the ureter, and it can then exit the body. I'm sure by now you've come to realize that the kidney function is actually quite complicated. So let's try and represent it in a slightly different format and see if we can clarify all of the different steps. So dirty blood comes in, and then via the glomerulus, the materials get separated. We get filtrate, which contains the waste material, but unfortunately also contains lots of useful material, and that goes into the tubule. This gets separated from the blood, but it's incomplete blood right now because there's still lots of useful material like glucose and amino acids and things like that, which are absent from the blood vessel. Through a process of selective reabsorption, material that is useful will be transferred back into the blood. And we've now got clean blood, which is complete. It's got all of the useful things. And this leaves behind in the tubule only the waste material. And that's the urea, as well as salts that are in excess of requirements, water that's in excess of requirements, etc. This material is then going to leave the body. It's going to go to the bladder, and the material is now known as urine, and from there it can exit the body and go into the toilet. Obviously now the blood, which is useful, will go out of the kidneys via the renal vein, and it will go back into the circulation where it can be used like normal. Obviously, because this is quite a difficult topic, this is a place where people can quite easily lose marks in exams, so let's look at a possible question. The diagram shows a single nephron in the kidney. Describe the functions of the areas labelled X and Y on the diagram. And you should recognise that X is the glomerulus and Y is the tubule. So it's a 4-mark question. Let's see what you might say. At part X, the glomerulus, ultrafiltration takes place. Always name the processes. That's one of those kind of obvious points that people sometimes miss. Small molecules move from the blood into the renal capsule. So it's the direction of the movement and what is moving. They are forced into the capsule under high pressure. That concept of high pressure is quite important to how this process carries on. At part Y, selective reabsorption of useful molecules. Notice selective reabsorption. You'll lose the marks if you just say absorption. Give an example of the molecule that could be transferred. One of them would be glucose, but there's lots you could mention. And these materials are reabsorbed into the blood capillary. So that's saying that the useful stuff is then taken back to where it needs to be.
ठीक है, होपफुली क्लियर हो गया. चलो बस अभी भी थोड़ा थोड़ा नहीं नो नबील